A crater appeared in the middle of her property. And what was down there is astounding. Susan Henderson woke to a boom that made the whole house shake. Still dazed from sleep, she ran to her bedroom window and couldn't comprehend what her eyes were seeing. Where the backyard she had known for 15 years once was, there was now an immense hole that seemed to swallow half the land. The earth had opened during the night, creating a crater more than 5 meters wide right in the center of her property. Susan quickly put on her red coat, the one she wore to protect herself from the cold mornings in rural Kentucky, and ran outside to see what had happened up close. As she neared the edge, she gripped tightly the hammer she had grabbed from the garage, more out of protective instinct than any real need. What she saw down there left her speechless. It wasn't just dirt and rocks. There were concrete structures, what looked like part of a construction buried many years ago. "Good heavens," she murmured, covering her mouth with her free hand. Susan's heart was pounding erratically. She had lived alone in that house since inheriting the property from her Aunt Eleanor 5 years ago. No one had ever mentioned anything buried there. Her aunt had always been very private about the family history, but she never spoke of underground constructions. The sound of footsteps made her turn quickly. It was her neighbor, Mr. Harold, a man of nearly 70 who had lived in the house next door since she moved in. "Mrs. Susan, I heard the noise and came to see if you were all right," he said, panting from the run. When he saw the crater, his eyes widened. "My God in heaven, what happened here?" "I woke to a terrible boom and found this," replied Susan, still in shock. "Mr. Harold, do you know if there was anything buried here?" The neighbor carefully approached the edge, observing the concrete structures visible among the churned earth. "Mrs. Susan, I need to tell you something. I've always avoided speaking about this, but I think the time has come. This property has a very strange history. Your Aunt Eleanor never wanted me to say anything, but now—" Susan felt a chill in her stomach. Her aunt had always been a mysterious woman, full of secrets she carried like heavy burdens. "What kind of history, Mr. Harold?" "In the 1960s, when I was still young, a very respected family lived here, the Thompsons. They had a lot of money, but suddenly out of nowhere they all vanished. The house stood abandoned for years until your aunt bought the land and built this new house on top." Her neighbor's words made Susan remember vague conversations she had overheard as a child. Her mother, Grace, would sometimes make strange comments about Eleanor's family, but always changed the subject when Susan asked questions. "The Thompsons vanished just like that, without a trace." "It was very strange, Mrs. Susan. They had a young daughter, Mrs. Dorothy, who was friends with your aunt when they were young. One day they were here, the next they simply weren't. People whispered about what might have happened." Susan looked again at the crater. A rusted metal staircase appeared among the debris, descending into what seemed like a preserved underground structure. "Mr. Harold, do you think this down here has something to do with that family?" "I don't know, but your aunt always got very nervous when anyone mentioned the Thompsons, as if she knew something she couldn't tell." Susan's curiosity was turning into an urgent need to discover the truth. All her life, she had felt her family was hiding important secrets. Her mother had been a closed-off woman who rarely spoke of the past. Her Aunt Eleanor was even more reserved. "I'm going down to see what's down there," declared Susan, testing if the metal ladder was steady. "Mrs. Susan, that could be dangerous. The structure might be unstable. Better to call the fire department or someone who understands these things. Mr. Harold, I need to know what's happening here. This is my property, and I have the right to find out what's on my own land." There was something in Susan's voice that Harold recognized. It was the same stubborn determination that Eleanor showed when she made a decision. The two women were more alike than either would care to admit. "If you're really going down, at least let me go get a better flashlight, and I'll let my wife know where we are just in case something happens." While Harold went to get the equipment, Susan was left alone looking at the opening in the earth. Something inside her said her life was about to change completely. She had always had the feeling that she didn't truly know her own history, as if important pieces had been deliberately left out. At 47, Susan had spent most of her adult life caring for her sick mother, and then for Aunt Eleanor in her final years. She never married, never had children, always put the family's needs first. After she inherited the house, she finally thought she could have a quieter life, but now it seemed the secrets of the past were literally emerging from the ground. Harold returned with a powerful flashlight and a rope. "Mrs. Susan, if you're really going down, at least take this, and I'll stay up here to help if you need it." "Thank you, Mr. Harold. You're quite a neighbor." Susan tied the rope around her waist and began to descend the metal ladder. The steps were damp and slippery, but seemed safe. With each step down, she felt as if she were descending not just physically, but also in time. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The flashlight light revealed that she was entering a kind of underground shelter. The walls were solid concrete, and the space was surprisingly well preserved. Furniture covered in dusty tarps occupied the area, and wooden crates were stacked against the walls. "My God," whispered Susan. "This looks like an entire house buried down here." She carefully illuminated the space. The shelter was larger than it seemed from above. It had at least 3 connected rooms, all built with care and attention to detail. It didn't look like a makeshift construction, but rather something planned and executed with considerable resources. In the first room, Susan found period furniture that seemed to be from the 1960s. Sofas, a coffee table, even an old radio set. Everything was covered in dust, but in surprisingly good condition. She moved toward the stacked crates. The first one she opened contained photographs and documents. Her hands trembled when she saw the first images. They were pictures of a family, a distinguished man, a beautiful woman, and a little girl. But what shocked her was the incredible resemblance between the woman in the photos and her own mother. "This can't be possible," she murmured, picking up more photographs. The more she looked, the more the resemblance became undeniable. The woman in the photos had the same eyes, the same face shape, even the same way of smiling that her mother had when she was younger. One of the photographs had a note on the back: Dorothy Thompson, 15 years old, 1962. Susan felt as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Dorothy was the name of the Thompsons' daughter that Mr. Harold had mentioned, but it was also her mother's middle name, Mary Dorothy Henderson. With trembling hands, she opened another box. This time she found official documents, certificates, and papers that spoke about the Thompson family. There were also letters, many letters handwritten on letterhead paper. Susan opened one of the letters and began to read. "My dear daughter Dorothy, if you are reading this, it means we managed to hide these things in the right place. Time is running out, and we have to leave you safely with people we trust. One day, when it is safe, we will return for you. Until then, know that everything we did was out of love and to protect our family. Your mother, who loves you, Margaret Thompson." The letter fell from Susan's hands. Her mind tried to process what she was reading. If Dorothy was her mother, that meant the Thompsons were her grandparents. But why had her mother never told the truth about her origin? She picked up other documents and found birth certificates, property deeds, and even bank records. The Thompson family owned several properties in the region and had considerable financial resources. There were also documents that spoke of threats and dangerous people who were pursuing them. "Mrs. Susan, is everything all right down there?" shouted Mr. Harold from above. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice trembled. "I found many things here. I'll stay a bit longer." In the shelter's second room, Susan discovered what appeared to be an office. There was an old desk with locked drawers. Using the hammer she still carried, she managed to force one of the drawers open. Inside were more letters and what looked like a diary. The diary belonged to Margaret Thompson, her grandmother. The first entries spoke of a normal and happy life, but as the dates progressed, the tone became increasingly worried. March 15th, 1963. "The threats are getting more serious. Edward thinks we should send Dorothy to a safe place. I don't want to be separated from my daughter, but perhaps it's the only way to protect her. March 22, 1963. It's decided. Dorothy will stay with Eleanor. She is the only person we can trust completely. We will tell our daughter it's only temporary, that we'll return soon. God willing, it's true." March 30th, 1963. "Today was the hardest day of my life. We gave our little girl to Eleanor. Dorothy cried a lot, but we explained it was like an adventure, that we would soon come back for her. We prepared this shelter with everything important for our family. If something happens to us, at least Dorothy will have a way to learn her true story when she grows up. Susan sat down heavily in a dusty chair. Tears streamed down her face. Her mother wasn't really the daughter of whom she had always thought. She had been raised by Eleanor, who was apparently a friend of her real parents. But why had no one ever told the truth? Why had her mother grown up not knowing her true origin? And what had happened to the Thompsons? Continuing to read the diary, Susan found answers to some of these questions. April 5th, 1963. Things are worse than we imagined. We discovered the people threatening us have important political connections. It's not just about our properties. It's about what Edward discovered working at City Hall. They are capable of anything to keep their secrets safe. April 10th, 1963. We decided to leave tonight. We left detailed instructions for Eleanor on how to care for Dorothy and when to reveal the truth. If we don't return in 6 months, she must tell our daughter everything when she turns 18. We pray this nightmare ends soon, and we can return to our little girl. The last diary entry was in different handwriting, apparently Eleanor's. October 15th, 1963. It has been 6 months since Edward and Margaret left. I have had no more news from them. Dorothy has adjusted well and calls me Aunt. She no longer talks about her parents as if she had forgotten. Perhaps it's better this way. I'll wait for her to grow up to tell the truth, but each passing day it gets harder. How do you explain to a child that her parents simply vanished? Susan closed the diary and rested her head in her hands. Her Aunt Eleanor had raised her mother, but never managed to tell the truth about her origin, probably for protection, or perhaps because it was too painful to admit that the friends never returned. There was still a third room in the shelter. Susan got up and went to investigate. This room was smaller and seemed to have been used as storage. There were more boxes, but also something that immediately caught her attention. An old safe embedded in the wall. The safe was locked, but there was a small key taped to the back. Someone had hidden the key there, probably hoping it would be found by the right person at the right time. Susan opened the safe with trembling hands. Inside were jewels, old money, and more documents. But what truly stunned her was a sealed envelope with her own name, for Mary Dorothy or her descendants. She opened the envelope and found a letter addressed specifically to her mother. My dear Dorothy, if you are reading this, it means something happened to us and we couldn't return as promised. We want you to know that our leaving was not our choice. We were forced to leave you to protect your life. The people who pursued us were powerful and dangerous, and our only option was to ensure you grew up safely away from all of it. In this safe you will find documents that prove your true identity and inheritance. You are the daughter of Edward and Margaret Thompson, and our family owns properties and resources that legally belong to you. Eleanor has instructions on how to proceed when you are ready to claim what is yours. We know growing up without knowing the truth about your origin must have been difficult. Forgive us for not finding a better way. We did what we thought was right at the time. If you have children, know that they are also part of this inheritance. Our family must not be forgotten. With eternal love, your parents, Edward and Margaret Thompson. Susan was trembling. She held in her hands the proof that her family had a completely different history from what she had always believed. But why did her mother never know about this? Why did Eleanor never show these letters to her? Continuing to sift through the documents in the safe, Susan found the answer to that question as well. There was a letter from Eleanor to her mother, dated 1981, when Dorothy turned 18. Dear Dorothy, today you turn 18, and the moment I most feared has arrived. Your true parents, Edward and Margaret, left me clear instructions to reveal your true story today. But I couldn't. You have become my daughter in every sense. You have called me mother for so many years that I couldn't shatter that illusion. Perhaps I am a coward, or perhaps I am just a woman who learned to love a child as if she were her own daughter. I will keep this letter and all the documents until I find the courage to tell the truth, or until you discover it yourself. If something happens to me, at least you will have a way to learn your true story. Forgive me for not being brave enough to keep the promise I made to your parents. Eleanor. The pieces of the puzzle finally fit together. Eleanor had grown so attached to the girl she raised that she couldn't part with her, not even by revealing the truth. She preferred to carry the secret to the end of her life than risk losing her adoptive daughter. Susan remained seated in the shelter for over an hour, absorbing everything she had discovered. Her entire life had been built upon a well-intentioned lie. Her mother had lived and passed away without ever knowing her true roots. When she finally climbed back to the surface, Mr. Harold was worried. "Mrs. Susan, you were taking so long I almost went after you. Did you find anything important down there?" "Mr. Harold, I found more than I ever imagined possible. I discovered that my mother was the daughter of the Thompsons you mentioned. My Aunt Eleanor raised her but never told her the truth about her origins." The neighbor's face showed genuine surprise. "Good heavens! So your mother was little Dorothy? I remember her as a child. She was a beautiful girl, very much like you when you were younger." "You remember my mother as a child?" "Of course. Eleanor always said she had adopted a niece, but I knew that wasn't quite the case." The girl appeared suddenly, and Eleanor never liked to talk much about how she got here. Susan realized that Mr. Harold might have more important information about her family. "Do you know what happened to her parents, to Edward and Margaret Thompson?" Harold scratched his head, as if trying to recall old events. "We never knew for sure, Mrs. Susan. There were many rumors at the time. Some said they left during the night. Others said something happened to them. What I do know is that they had gotten involved with powerful people here in the region." "What kind of people?" "Edward worked at City Hall and had discovered some irregularities in public works bids. Back then, questioning those things was very dangerous. There were influential families who controlled everything in town and didn't like to be contradicted." This information made Susan understand the context of the threats mentioned in the diary better. Her grandparents weren't just rich people who fled out of fear. They had uncovered corruption, and it had put their lives in danger. "Do those families still have influence here in the region?" "Some do, Mrs. Susan. The children and grandchildren still control many businesses in town. Of course, things are different now, more democratic, but there are still those who hold a lot of power around here." During the following days, Susan couldn't think of anything else besides her discovery. She revisited the shelter several times, studying every document, every photograph, every clue about her true family history. There were lists of properties that belonged to the Thompsons spread throughout the region: farms, commercial land, even shares in local companies. If the documents were correct, her family had been much richer than she had ever imagined. But what intrigued her most were the constant references to the legitimate inheritance and the rights that must be preserved. It was as if Edward and Margaret knew that one day someone would try to question the ownership of their assets. 1 week after the discovery of the crater, Susan received an unexpected visit. A well-dressed man appeared at her door, introducing himself as Mr. Richard Walsh, an attorney. "Mrs. Susan, I came to see you because I heard about the discovery you made on your property. I represent some companies interested in real estate development in the area." Susan was immediately suspicious. How could he know about the shelter? She had only told Mr. Harold, who was a completely trustworthy person. "How did you know about what I found here?" "News travels fast in small towns, ma'am, and the fact is, we are preparing a development project that would include this area. We would like to make an offer to acquire your property." "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Richard." "Mrs. Susan, the offer is very generous. 500,000 reais for a property that is certainly worth much less on the current market. It's a unique opportunity." The attorney's insistence and the amount offered made Susan even more suspicious. Why would anyone pay so much for her property? And why now, right after she discovered the shelter? "I need to think about the proposal. Come back next week." After the lawyer left, Susan went to talk with Mr. Harold. "Mr. Harold, a lawyer showed up here wanting to buy my house. He offered a very high price and said he heard about my discovery. Did you tell anyone about the shelter?" "No way, Mrs. Susan. I didn't even tell my wife. I thought it best to keep this between us until you decided what to do." "Then how did this man find out?" Harold thought for a moment. "Mrs. Susan, it's possible someone has been watching your house. When the crater opened, it made a noise the whole neighborhood heard. Someone might have come to investigate and seen you going down into the shelter." The possibility of being watched without knowing left Susan uneasy. She decided to be more cautious and install some security cameras around the property. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, in the following days, Susan dove completely into the investigation about her family. She visited the town clerk's office to check the property records mentioned in the documents she found. To her surprise, many of the lands that supposedly belonged to the Thompsons were now registered under other people's names. The clerk's office employee, Mrs. Ruth, was a lady who had worked there for over 40 years. Mrs. Ruth, I'm researching properties that belonged to the Thompson family in the 1960s. Do you remember them? Of course I remember. Edward and Margaret were very respected people. They owned a lot of property here in the region. But after they disappeared, there was a terrible mess with the records. What kind of mess? Several people showed up saying they had bought the lands from the Thompsons before they left. They brought sales documents, powers of attorney, things like that. Since no one could contact Edward and Margaret to confirm, the records ended up being transferred. Susan felt her blood boil. It was exactly what she suspected. Taking advantage of her grandparents' disappearance, unscrupulous people had taken possession of their properties using fake documents. Mrs. Ruth, were those sales documents verified at the time? Well, Mrs. Susan, in the 1960s things worked differently. If a person came here with papers that looked legal, especially if they were someone influential in town, they rarely questioned it much, and some of the people who bought those lands were very powerful. Do you remember who those people were? Ruth looked around carefully before answering, as if afraid of being overheard. Most of the properties ended up in the hands of the Harrison family. They controlled a lot of business in town back then. The patriarch, Colonel Benjamin Harrison, had a lot of political power. The name Harrison sounded familiar to Susan. She was sure she had heard that name before, possibly in family conversations when she was a child. Is that family still active in town? Colonel Benjamin's children and grandchildren still control several companies. One of the main ones is Harrison Development, which handles real estate projects in the region. Susan made the connection immediately. The lawyer who had appeared at her house talked about real estate development. Could it just be a coincidence? She decided to investigate more about the Harrison family. Research at the municipal library revealed that Colonel Benjamin had been a controversial figure in local politics. There were several accusations of corruption and abuse of power over the years, although he was never formally convicted. In the old newspapers, Susan found a story that alarmed her. Local businessman reports irregularities in City Hall. Edward Thompson, Public Works Department employee, submitted report pointing to possible fraud in public bids. Colonel Benjamin Harrison denies involvement and promises defamation lawsuit. The story was from March 1963, just a few weeks before her grandparents' disappearance. It was clear there was a direct connection between Edward's reports and their subsequent flight. Susan returned home determined to fully understand what had happened to her family. In the shelter, she searched for more evidence that could confirm her suspicions. In a box that had initially gone unnoticed, she found copies of official documents that Edward had prepared to prove the irregularities he had discovered. There were contracts for overpriced construction projects, fake invoices, and correspondence that showed the corruption scheme in detail. There were also letters that Edward had sent to state authorities, trying to report what was happening in the city. The responses showed he was being taken seriously, but also that there was political pressure to cover up the case. One particularly revealing letter was from Colonel Benjamin himself to Edward. Mr. Thompson, I suggest you reconsider your position regarding City Hall matters. Family men should always think of the safety of their loved ones before making hasty decisions. It would be very sad if something unfortunate happened to innocent people because of misunderstandings. The threat was clear and direct. Colonel Benjamin was using the Thompsons' young daughter as leverage to pressure Edward to stop his reports. Susan understood that her grandparents hadn't fled out of cowardice. They were forced to leave everything behind to protect their daughter's life. And probably, after they left, they could never return because something had happened to them. This revelation left her furious. Her mother had grown up without knowing her real parents because greedy men had destroyed her family to cover up their crimes. And now, apparently, The descendants of those same people were trying to buy her property. Susan decided it was time to act. She wasn't going to let those responsible for destroying her family continue to benefit from their injustices. First, she sought out another lawyer, Mr. David Miller, who had a reputation for honesty in the city. "Mr. David, I need your help with a very complicated case. I've discovered that my family was the victim of a property theft scheme in the 1960s, and I have evidence that proves it." She showed him all the documents she had found in the shelter. The lawyer was impressed by the quantity and quality of the evidence. "Mrs. Susan, this is very serious. If these documents are authentic, there are crimes past the statute of limitations, but also property rights that may still be valid. We'll need a technical examination to confirm their authenticity, but if proven, you could be entitled to considerable restitution." "Mr. David, I'm not just interested in the money. I want the truth about what happened to my family to be known. I want justice." "I understand perfectly, Mrs. Susan. We'll work on both fronts, seeking the financial restitution that is your right, and also making public what happened." During the following weeks, Mr. David worked tirelessly, gathering more evidence and preparing the case. He discovered that several of the properties that had belonged to the Thompsons were still being used by the Harrisons or by companies controlled by them. An investigation of the municipal records revealed that many public works projects carried out on the land originally belonging to the Thompsons had been overpriced, exactly as Edward had reported decades before. "Mrs. Susan, we have enough material to file a historical reparations lawsuit and also to request an investigation into the legitimacy of the property transfers. Meanwhile, the attempts to buy your house have intensified. Mr. Richard Walsh came back several times, always increasing the offer. On his last visit, he was clearly irritated. "Mrs. Susan, you are being very stubborn. Our offer has already reached 1 million Rs. It's more money than you ever imagined having." "Mr. Richard, I've already said I have no interest in selling, and now I've discovered why you are so interested in this property." The lawyer's expression changed. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the Thompson family, Mr. Richard. I'm talking about what you did to my grandparents in the 1960s. The man visibly paled. "I don't know what you're talking about. These are very serious accusations. I have documents that prove everything. I know about the corruption. I know about the threats. I know about the theft of the properties. And I will make all of this public." Mr. Richard left Susan's house visibly shaken. She knew she had hit a nerve, and that from that moment on, things would become more complicated. The following week, strange things happened around her house. Unknown cars drove slowly down the street several times a day. Someone tried to break into the shelter during the night, but the security cameras captured the images. Mr. Harold was worried. "Mrs. Susan, I think you'd better be careful. You're messing with very powerful people. Maybe it's better to accept their offer and move somewhere else." "Mr. Harold, I will not run away like my grandparents were forced to do. This is my home, my legitimate heritage, and I will fight for what is mine." Susan's determination impressed her neighbor, but it also worried him. He knew from experience how ruthless the Harrison family could be when their interests were threatened. Mr. David Miller brought good news. "Mrs. Susan, the forensic analysis confirmed that all the documents are authentic. We also managed to locate records in the State Archive that corroborate the allegations of Edward Thompson regarding corruption at City Hall. We have a solid case. And now, how do we proceed? We will file 2 lawsuits, one civil, seeking financial reparations for the stolen properties, and another criminal, requesting an investigation into the crimes committed, even if many are beyond the statute of limitations." The news of the lawsuit spread quickly through the town. The Harrison family, which for decades had carefully controlled its public image, suddenly found itself exposed in a scandal dating back to the origins of its fortune. Regional newspapers began covering the story. Susan found herself at the center of a controversy that divided opinions in the town. Some people supported her, admiring her courage. Others criticized her for stirring up old matters that should stay in the past. During an interview with the local newspaper, Susan explained her motivations. "I'm not doing this for revenge or for money. I'm doing this because my mother lived her whole life not knowing who she really was. She passed away without knowing her true parents because of the greed and cruelty of some people. That cannot be forgotten or forgiven simply because it happened a long time ago. The interview prompted a response from the Harrison family through their lawyer. Our family has always acted within the law. The properties in question were acquired through legitimate transactions, properly registered. Any accusation to the contrary is an attempt at extortion based on documents that may have been forged. But the evidence gathered by Mr. David was so robust that this defense convinced no one. Historical document experts confirmed the authenticity of all the items found in the shelter. During the investigation process, even more disturbing facts came to light. Mr. David discovered that Edward and Margaret Thompson had not simply fled the city. There were records showing they were last seen on a rural road, apparently heading toward another town. Witnesses from that time, who were now elderly people, began to come forward. One was especially impactful. Mrs. Martha, 85 years old, sought out Susan at home. "Dear, I saw your story in the paper, and I need to tell you something I've kept for over 60 years. On the night your grandparents disappeared, I was working as a cook at the Harrison farm. I overheard a conversation I could never forget." "What did you hear, Mrs. Martha?" "Colonel Benjamin talking with two men about solving the Thompson problem once and for all. They talked about a trip from which there would be no return. I never fully understood it, but I always suspected something terrible had happened." Mrs. Martha's testimony was the missing piece to give the case its full dimension. Edward and Margaret had probably not managed to escape successfully. Something had happened to them during the attempt to flee. Mr. David took this information to the competent authorities, and an official investigation was opened. Although it was unlikely anyone would be criminally punished due to the time elapsed, at least the truth was finally coming to light. The pressure on the Harrison family increased drastically. Companies that did business with them began to pull away. The reputation they had carefully built over decades was being destroyed. In a desperate attempt to control the damage, they made a proposal to Susan through Mr. Richard Walsh. "Mrs. Susan, my clients are willing to make a deal. They admit there may have been irregularities in the past and are prepared to offer substantial compensation to settle this matter out of court." "What kind of compensation?" 5 million reais, plus the return of 2 properties that originally belonged to the Thompsons. In return, you would withdraw all accusations and sign a confidentiality agreement. The offer was tempting, but Susan had other principles in mind. "Mr. Richard, I do not accept confidentiality agreements. If they want to make amends, let them do so publicly, admitting what they did. The truth about my family cannot be bought." Susan's refusal to accept the silent deal deeply angered the Harrison family. They were not used to being contradicted, especially by someone they considered a simple country housewife. The pressures on Susan intensified. She began receiving anonymous threatening phone calls. Her house was vandalized several times. Someone even cut the electricity at night. Mr. Harold suggested she go live with relatives in another city until the situation calmed down, but Susan was unyielding. "I will not leave my home. If they want to intimidate me, they'll find they picked the wrong person." Susan's courage inspired other people in town who had been harmed by the Harrison family over the years. Other complaints of irregularities, abuse of power, and corruption began to surface. A former City Hall employee, Mrs. Helen, sought out Mr. David. "Doctor, I worked at City Hall for 30 years and always knew a lot was wrong. Edward Thompson wasn't the only one who tried to speak up. There were others, but they were all silenced one way or another." "How so, Mrs. Helen?" "Some were fired, others were transferred to distant towns. There were cases of people who suffered strange accidents after questioning what was going on. The climate of fear was so great that no one dared say anything." The revelations from Mrs. Helen showed that the case of the Thompsons was not isolated. There was a pattern of intimidation and silencing that lasted for decades. Mr. David gathered all the new testimonies and presented an even more serious picture to the authorities. The case that began as a property issue was turning into an investigation into decades of organized crime and systematic corruption. Pressure from the media and public opinion forced the authorities to take the case more seriously. A task force was created to investigate all accusations against the Harrison family and their companies. During a search and seizure at the headquarters of Harrison Development, documents were found that confirmed many of the suspicions. There were records of bribes, fraudulent contracts, and even references to problem elimination, a euphemism that could include the threats made to people like Edward Thompson. The discovery of these documents completely changed the course of the case. What was a civil matter became an active criminal investigation. Several members of the Harrison family were arrested for questioning. Susan watched everything with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She was seeing justice being done, but she also knew that nothing could bring her grandparents back or fully compensate for the suffering her family had endured. During the trial, which became the most famous case in the city's history, many truths were revealed. Witnesses who had been intimidated for decades finally found the courage to speak. The most impactful testimony came from an old enforcer of Colonel Benjamin, now elderly and in his final days of life. "I took part in many things I'm ashamed of today. The Thompson case was one of the worst. They never had a chance to reach their destination. The colonel said it was to look like a road accident." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Finally, after more than 60 years, the truth about the fate of Edward and Margaret Thompson was being revealed. The trial ended with significant convictions for the living members of the Harrison family. Although many of the main crimes had passed the statute of limitations, they were convicted of money laundering, active corruption, and forming a criminal organization, crimes that had continued over the years. Susan recovered not only her family's original properties, but also received substantial compensation for decades of misuse. More important to her, the truth about her grandparents was officially recognized and recorded. With the recovered resources, Susan decided to create a foundation in memory of Edward and Margaret Thompson. The foundation would dedicate itself to helping families who were victims of historical injustices and to preserving the memory of people who fought against corruption. The underground shelter where it all began was transformed into a memorial. Susan kept everything exactly as she had found it, creating a museum that tells not only the story of her family, but also the story of resistance against injustice. Mr. Harold, who had followed the entire saga, was moved to see the transformation. "Mrs. Susan, your Aunt Eleanor would be so proud to see what you've done. She was always a courageous woman, but I don't think she ever imagined her niece would be even more courageous. Mr. Harold, I understand why my aunt couldn't tell the truth to my mother. It must have been very hard to carry that secret alone, but now, finally, all our family's secrets have come to light." Susan also decided to look for other possible relatives of the Thompson family. Through genealogists and researchers, she discovered that Edward had a brother who had emigrated to Chicago before the events of 1963. The brother, Charles Thompson, had already passed, but his children were still alive. When Susan contacted them and explained the story, they were moved to finally discover what had happened to Edward. "Our father could never find out what happened to his brother," said Michael, son of Charles. "He died without knowing the truth. But now, at least, we can honor the memory of Uncle Edward and Aunt Margaret." The family reunion, after more than 60 years, was a moment of great emotion. Susan finally met cousins she didn't even know existed, and they were able to share memories and stories about the family. Michael brought old photographs and documents that Charles had kept about his brother. There were letters Edward sent to Chicago shortly before disappearing, speaking about his concerns with the situation in the city. "Aunt Susan," said Michael, addressing Susan as aunt despite being cousins. "Our father always said Edward was a man of principles. He would never accept an injustice without fighting against it. I think you inherited that from him." The discovery that she had a larger family than she imagined brought a new dimension to Susan's life. She had spent most of her life feeling alone in the world, but now she had cousins, nephews and nieces, and even great-grandchildren. 1 year after the whole saga began, Susan organized a ceremony in memory of Edward and Margaret Thompson. The ceremony took place at what was now officially the Thompson Memorial, built over the site where the crater had opened. Hundreds of people attended, including authorities, journalists, family members, and people who had been inspired by Susan's story of courage. The city's mayor made an official statement acknowledging the injustices committed in the past and promising they would never be repeated. During the ceremony, Susan gave a speech that moved everyone present. "My dear grandparents, Edward and Margaret, you sacrificed your lives to protect your daughter. You could never return to get her as you promised, but your love and courage crossed generations. Today, finally, the truth about you is known. You did not die in vain. Your fight against injustice lives on through all of us who decide not to remain silent in the face of what is wrong." After the ceremony, Susan received dozens of letters from people all over the country who had been touched by her story. Many shared their own experiences with family injustices and asked for advice on how to proceed. She decided to expand the Thompson Foundation to meet these demands. With the help of Mr. David and other volunteer lawyers, she created a legal support service for families who had suffered historical injustices. "Mr. David, when I started this fight, I was just looking for answers about my own family. I never imagined it would become something so much bigger." Mrs. Susan, sometimes one courageous person is all it takes to change many lives. Your courage inspired others to also seek truth and justice. 2 years later, Susan was working on a book telling her story. She wanted her family's experience to be preserved not just as a memorial, but as an example that it is never too late to fight injustice. The book, titled "The Crater That Revealed the Truth," would become a regional bestseller and would be used in schools to teach about the importance of integrity and civic courage. One afternoon, while working on the book in her office, the same room in the shelter where she found her grandmother's diary, Susan reflected on how her life had completely changed. She was no longer the lonely, resigned woman living isolated in her home. She had become an active defender of justice, a respected community leader, and most importantly, she had found a family she didn't even know existed. The crater that once terrified her when it opened in her backyard had become the gateway to a new life full of purpose, connection, and meaning. Her cousin Michael visited regularly, bringing his children to learn the family history. The children were fascinated by the memorial and always asked questions about the great-grandparents they had never met. "Aunt Susan," asked Emily, Michael's 10-year-old daughter, "do you think great-grandfather Edward would be proud of what you did?" Susan smiled, remembering the words from her grandmother Margaret's diary about never letting the family be forgotten. "I think so, dear. I think they would be very proud to know their story wasn't forgotten and that the truth finally came to light." The girl nodded seriously, as if understanding the importance of what had happened. "When I grow up, I'll take care of our family's memory too." This innocent promise from a child represented for Susan the certainty that the legacy of Edward and Margaret Thompson would continue to live on through future generations. 3 years after the discovery of the crater, Susan received a letter that moved her deeply. It was from a woman from another state who had read about her story in the newspapers. "Dear Mrs. Susan, my name is Rebecca, and I am the great-granddaughter of people who were friends with your grandparents. My great-grandmother always told stories about Edward and Margaret Thompson, saying they were wonderful people who disappeared mysteriously. She never believed the official version that they had fled the city. She always said something terrible had happened to them. Now, reading your story, I finally understand that my great-grandmother's intuition was right. I would very much like to visit you and share the memories she kept of your grandparents." Susan replied to the letter immediately, inviting Rebecca for a visit. When they met, Rebecca brought old photographs and even some objects her great-grandmother had kept as mementos of the disappeared friends. "My great-grandmother, Mrs. Louise, was your grandmother Margaret's best friend," Rebecca recounted. "When the Thompsons disappeared, she was devastated. She spent the rest of her life trying to find out what had happened to them." Rebecca showed a wooden box containing letters that Margaret had sent to her great-grandmother in the months before the disappearance. "She asked me to keep these letters and only give them to someone from the Thompson family if one day someone appeared looking for them. I think that moment has come." The letters revealed intimate details about Margaret's fears and worries in the last months of her life. In one of them she wrote, Dear Louise, I am very worried about Edward. He has discovered things at City Hall that could put our family in danger. We've already thought about sending our little Dorothy to a safe place, but it's too painful to think of being separated from her. If something happens to us, please make sure our daughter knows we loved her more than anything in the world." Susan cried upon reading these words. It was like hearing her grandmother's voice speaking directly to her across time. "Rebecca, these letters are a precious gift. I will place them in the memorial so others can know the human side of my grandparents' story." The friendship that developed between Susan and Rebecca brought even more richness to both their lives. They discovered their families had been close for generations, and that fate had finally reunited them. Rebecca decided to move to Susan's city to help with the foundation's work. She had experience in social work and could contribute greatly to expanding the services offered to families in need. Together, they created a support program for elderly people who, like Susan's mother, had lived without knowing their true family origins. Many people in the region had similar stories of informal adoptions, families separated during periods of political turmoil, and family secrets kept for generations. "Susan, I think our mission isn't just to honor the memory of your grandparents," said Rebecca during a foundation planning meeting. "It's also to help other families discover their own truths." This expanded perspective gave even more purpose to Susan's work. She realized her personal experience had become a tool to help other people in similar situations. 5 years after the discovery of the crater, the Thompson Memorial had become one of the most visited tourist spots in the region, not just for its historical importance, but for the inspiring example of courage and perseverance it represented. Students from various universities came to study the case as an example of how civil society can fight corruption and injustice. Oral history researchers recorded testimonies from elderly people who had memories from the time of the Thompsons. A documentary about Susan's story was produced by a national television network, bringing her experience to millions of people across the country. The documentary, called The Truth That Emerged from the Earth, won several awards and inspired others to investigate historical injustices in their own communities. During one of the interviews for the documentary, Susan reflected on the meaning of her entire journey. "When that crater opened in my backyard, I thought it was just a problem that needed to be solved. I never imagined it was the beginning of a journey that would change not only my life, but the lives of so many other people. The truth has a force of its own. When it finally comes to light, it transforms everything around it." The documentary also featured interviews with members of the Harrison family who were willing to speak about the crimes of their ancestors. Some of them expressed genuine remorse and publicly supported the work of the Thompson Foundation. "What our ancestors did was terrible and unjustifiable," said Robert Harrison Jr., grandson of Colonel Benjamin. "We cannot change the past, but we can work to ensure these injustices are never repeated." This statement marked an important moment of reconciliation. Although legal justice had been served, social reconciliation was equally important for the community's healing. Susan accepted the collaboration of the remorseful members of the Harrison family in the Foundation's work. She believed the true victory over injustice was not in revenge, but in the transformation of people and institutions. 6 years later, Susan was about to turn 53 when she received news that left her deeply moved. Researchers had located the remains of Edward and Margaret Thompson. Using information revealed during the trial and new investigative technologies, a team of forensic archaeologists had found evidence in a remote rural location far from the city. DNA collected from Susan confirmed the identity of the remains. Finally, after more than 60 years, Edward and Margaret Thompson could have a dignified burial. The burial ceremony was a moment of deep emotion and closure for Susan and the entire family. Hundreds of people attended, including authorities, relatives, and people who had been touched by the story. "Grandpa Edward, Grandma Margaret," said Susan during the ceremony. "Finally, you can rest in peace. Your daughter grew up without knowing you, but she was a good and honorable woman who would have made you proud. And now the whole family knows the truth about the love and courage you showed." The Thompson tomb was built in the municipal cemetery in a special plot donated by the city. A memorial plaque tells their story for future generations, ensuring their sacrifice is never forgotten. After the burial, Susan felt as if a cycle had been completed. She had fully honored the memory of her grandparents and ensured the truth about them was preserved forever. With the completion of this phase of her mission, Susan decided to focus more energy on the Foundation's preventive work. Partnering with schools and community organizations, she developed educational programs about ethics, civic courage, and the importance of never staying silent in the face of injustice. "Our greatest victory," Susan said during a seminar for young people, wasn't just discovering the truth about the past. It was creating a future where such injustices are much harder to happen because people have the courage to speak the truth. The Foundation's educational programs spread to other cities in the region. Young people who participated in the seminars began creating their own social activism groups in their schools and communities. One of the most active participants was Emily, Michael's daughter, who was now 15. She became a student leader dedicated to fighting corruption and promoting transparency in local government. "Aunt Susan, you taught me that one person can make a difference when they have the courage to fight for what's right," Emily said during a Foundation meeting. "Now I want to dedicate my life to continuing this work." Seeing the new generation embracing the values she had fought for gave Susan a deep sense of fulfillment. She knew the legacy of Edward and Margaret Thompson would continue to live on through these young people inspired by their story. 7 years after the crater's discovery, Susan was invited to speak in Congress about anti-corruption legislation reforms. Her experience had become a case study on how civil society can effectively combat impunity. "Members of Congress," Susan said in her speech, "corruption thrives in silence and impunity. When ordinary people have the tools and the courage to fight injustice, real change can happen. My story isn't special because I was brave. It's special because it shows that we all have the power to make a difference when we decide not to accept injustice." Susan's speech was widely publicized and inspired the passage of new laws that facilitate the investigation of historical crimes and protect whistleblowers. Returning home after the experience in Washington, D.C., Susan sat in her office, the old shelter where it all began, and reflected on the extraordinary journey her life had become. She looked at the photographs of Edward and Margaret that now decorated the walls, side by side with photos of her mother, Dorothy, and her aunt Eleanor. For the first time, she had a complete portrait of her true family. "Mum," she whispered, looking at Dorothy's photograph, "you never knew the truth about your origin, but you lived the values your true parents would have wanted to pass on to you. You were an honest, hard-working and courageous woman. I'm sure they would be proud of the daughter they raised." In that moment of silence and contemplation, Susan felt a profound sense of peace. She had not only discovered the truth about her family, but had transformed that discovery into a force for good that would continue impacting lives for generations. The crater that once appeared on her land had become much more than a hole in the ground. It had become a symbol that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to emerge when someone is brave enough to look for it. As she wrote the final pages of her book, Susan thought of the words her grandmother Margaret had written in one of her last letters. "The truth is like a seed. It can stay buried for a long time, but when it finds the right conditions to grow, it always blooms." The crater had provided those right conditions, and from the truth that bloomed, justice, reconciliation, and a new hope for the future were born. 8 years later, on a sunny morning that reminded her of the one when it all began, Susan was working in the garden she had created around the memorial when she heard footsteps approaching. It was a young woman accompanied by an elderly lady. They approached timidly. "Mrs. Susan," asked the young woman, "my name is Claudia, and this is my grandmother, Mrs. Violet. We came from another state after reading about your story. My grandmother has some things she thinks might interest you." Mrs. Violet stepped forward with a timid smile. "My dear, I knew your grandparents when they were young, before they moved to this city. I kept some of their things and always wanted to return them to the family, but I never knew how to find you." She handed Susan a small wooden box. "These are love letters that Edward wrote to Margaret and some photographs from when they were engaged. I thought you would like to have them." Susan opened the box with trembling hands. The letters revealed the romantic and dreamy side of her grandparents, showing them as a young, passionate couple planning a future together. One of the letters said, "My dear Margaret, I dream of the day when we will have our own home, our children, and can live in peace building a family based on love and honesty. I want our descendants to be proud of the legacy we will leave for them." Tears rolled down Susan's face. It was as if her grandparents were speaking directly to her, confirming that everything she had done was aligned with their dreams and values. "Mrs. Violet, these are precious gifts. Thank you for keeping them for so long and for making the effort to bring them here. My child, when I read your story, I knew it was my duty to return these memories to where they belong. Edward and Margaret were special people, and you have proven that their love and honesty are still alive in the family." That unexpected encounter was one more confirmation for Susan that she had made the right decisions. Even 8 years later, her story continued to touch people and gather lost pieces of family memory. As the sun set that afternoon, Susan placed the new photographs at the memorial, further completing the portrait of who Edward and Margaret really were. Not just victims of an injustice, but whole people with dreams, love, and hopes for the future. The crater that had changed her life was now transformed into a beautiful memorial garden where children played, families visited, and students came to learn about history and courage. The place that once represented trauma and mystery had become a symbol of hope and renewal. That night, Susan wrote in her diary, "Today I fully understood that our journey was never just about discovering the past. It was about building a future where love and truth always triumph over fear and lies. The crater has closed, but the seeds we planted will keep growing forever." And so, the woman who once woke to the sound of earth splitting in her backyard had become the guardian of a truth that transformed not only her own life, but countless other lives around her. The crater had disappeared, but in its place, something much more lasting had bloomed. A reunited family, a more just community, and a legacy of courage that would pass from generation to generation. End of story. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out, now continuing. Now tell us what you thought of this incredible story of Susan and her discovery that changed everything. Do you believe that sometimes the hardest things in life can turn into the greatest blessings? Leave your honest opinion in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.